Good evening. It's great to have everyone here. My name is Rachel Cooper. I'm the Director of Global Performing Arts and Cultural Initiatives here at the Asia Society, and this is a real thrill. First, I think because the Viewpoints series that we have here, which is supported by Dini and Ashish Devitri, is really about new ideas and new perspectives and really pushing the envelope. And I can't think of any project that I've heard of that does that in such an inventive and innovative way, taking a multicultural, multidisciplinary approach than this project. So when we were approached by Harvard South Asian Institute to do something to celebrate this incredible project on the Kumbh Mela, mapping the ephemeral megacity, it brought together all of the interests, I think, of the Asia Society and of the South Asia Institute. It's a perfect marriage of that bringing together of education, new ideas, innovation, and particularly those things that are going on in Asia. And so often is the case that you see something that may be very ancient that in fact gives you a new understanding of contemporary urban society, or at least offers that possibility. And certainly this project does that. Just to say a couple of words about the Asian Society, as you know, this is all things Asia in all ways. So whether that's arts and culture, education, innovation, business, the museum, performances, films, even shopping. We try to bring it all together, and it's really a part of our mission, and it's a global mission. And so much of it is taking place both in physical proximity and having the face-to-face meetings that are so powerful, but also the work on the web. Our online team is constantly putting work out. Most of our programs are live streamed. We will be live streaming tonight, and we are also recording it so that people can access it at the time zone moment that they want. As you know, sometimes in Asia it means we're inviting people for breakfast and not everyone's ready for breakfast to start with the Kumbh Mela. Anyway, we're thrilled to be working here. I hope if you don't know the Asia Society that you'll learn more about us, consider joining. But number one, we're here to explore this extraordinary project. And we're going to start by seeing a film, and then we will go on to having Meera Gandhi here, who will give us an introduction. And then 3 presentations, and then a conversation. And we invite you all to join us at the very end for a reception, and we will have available the incredible book, and they'll talk a little bit more about that a little later in the evening. So let's see, what is this Kumbh Mela?
The idea was that we would bring the various schools at Harvard together in ways where there's inquiry happening on a particular issue, that they would be able to look at it in a cross-disciplinary way. Once the urban planning and the religious studies folks wanted to come together, there was also interest from the public health school. And there was interest from the business school folks as well, because each of these aspects are so relevant to the Mela.
The Kumbh Mela occurs every 12 years. The estimates for how many people will pass through here in the aggregate vary in the tens of millions, certainly 30 million at its peak. There is no other agglomeration of humanity at that scale anywhere on the face of the earth. And so it's a really interesting laboratory within which some deep questions about all sorts of issues: urbanization, public health, property rights, social agglomeration, epidemiology, all sorts of questions can be asked. So that's the reason why we zeroed in on it. And and decided to create the infrastructure to allow researchers to come here.
From the design school's perspective, we're interested in this question of extreme urbanism because this is a condition where a megacity is built temporarily. We think it has relevance for the rapidly growing cities in India, but more importantly, I think temporality as a condition is going to manifest itself much more in the world with the kind of disasters we see. So whether it's refugee camps or emergency housing, how can one actually deploy a viable urban system very, very quickly?
We try to build a three-dimensional map of all the Kumbh area. Where does everything comes from? What is the footprint it leaves in all the region? This is like a window for looking at technology at every 12 years. So you can trace back what are the main advances. And this year is our cell phones.
People who come here are convenienced, you might say, by the fact that there is this wonderful grid of an urban infrastructure that has been placed here so that they can live here for a month or for a few days. But the reason they come is something far more nuanced than that. They come because they want to bathe in the meeting rivers, in the Sangam of the Ganga and the Yamuna and the Saraswati. And they come because they want to have the blessings of the religious teachers. Our students are mapping in a different sense. They're looking at the meaning behind the facades, at what takes place on these streets and within these pavilions.
We are doing a session.
I came initially with the goal to figure out sort of the flow of how flowers got here. So from fields to trucks to markets to trucks to the Mela and then being sold. And I wanted to figure out who was selling them, who was buying them, and how they were being used. But when I got here, I realized that the new direction of the Kumbh has been a sort of environmental one. So this green Kumbh movement has really opened my eyes to the problem of flowers being sort of ending up in the Ganga here on the banks.
My role is to think, how can I take this experience, bring it into something that's bite-sized for a discussion for business people that's interesting to them, that gets them to feel of the Mela, but also exercises basic skills in finance planning and city development, and ideally stretches business people's thinking about how to compete with resource efficiency.
It's really interesting to think about the social networks of these vendors specifically. None of them are really making a profit, and we think it's interesting because this sort of social idea that the Kumbh is this huge commercial space is actually leading them to overserve the market.
You tell me. What's that? What if you saw a spike?
So we had a project in mind to support the Kumbh administration, for them to have a data set to look at their healthcare utilization and the potential for outbreaks over the course of the Kumbh. We call it surveillance. And surveillance just is that. It is looking for symptoms or diseases that may occur in the population in time and place, and to be able to identify that rapidly, and then to be able to investigate it. There's a network of the sector hospitals at the field level that we've engaged, and we're going to track their registries. So all the patients they see in any given day, over time, we've set up a system for them to digitize all this information on iPads.
I think what we should kind of do from here. Over 400,000 patients that have been treated thus far at the hospitals in the Kumbh Mela area. Our study has captured about 10% of those patients, over 30,000, making it the largest data set that's ever been recorded for a transient mass gathering patient population. It gives you a lot of insight into a lot of the disease burden and a lot of the treatments and a lot of the resources that are required to manage a population of this size.
What I've found is once we are here, the students are asking the questions that are relevant to another discipline. Our hope is it'll bring the various schools and disciplines together to start to see where the overlap of questions are, as well as what were some of the observations that they found that would be relevant to further research.
So I'd like to introduce Meera Gandhi, who is an advisory council member of the Harvard South Asian Institute and the CEO and founder of the Giving Back Foundation. Transformational education of the girl child is the primary mission of the Giving Back Foundation, and the second arm is to act as a platform for dialogue and debate for young people to promote positive social change. The third arm, announced this year, is a spiritual arm, the mindfulness and yoga all-day camps that will commence in July 2016 in upstate New York, moving to other destinations in the US, India, and across the globe. Meera has been involved in the charity work for a quarter of a century, and her motto is, "We are to the universe only as much as we give back to it." Please join me in giving a big welcome to Meera Gandhi.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very, very exciting presentation of the Kumbh done by the best people on earth, Harvard University. So I'm particularly delighted to moderate this evening. As Rachel said, my affiliation is that I am on the advisory board of the Harvard South Asia Institute. I was also at the Kumbh Mela, and my family and I, along with the Giving Back Foundation, have now sponsored the Kumbh book, which will be on sale tonight. Please do purchase a copy, as well as the traveling exhibits that will move around the country and the world, really sharing this phenomenal phenomenon with everyone. In 2013, we were privileged. Before that, I would like to say that I will do a very quick overview of my experience at the Kumbh, and then I will invite up each professor who will do their short presentation, and then we will move to the panel discussion and really open it up to the audience to do sort of a fireside chat Q&A kind of evening, so it will be very interactive. In 2013, we were privileged to be invited by Professor Tarun Khanna, who is on the panel tonight, and Harvard South Asia Institute to attend the Kumbh Mela in Allahabad with the Harvard University team. The Kumbh Mela, as most of you already know, is believed to be the largest religious gathering on earth and is held every 12 years on the banks of the Sangam, which is the confluence of both Ganges, Yamuna, and the mythical Saraswati rivers. The Mela alternates between Nasik, Allahabad, Ujjain, Haridwar every 3 years. The one celebrated at the Holy Sangam in Allahabad is the largest and the holiest of them, and we were fortunate to experience the Kumbh through the eyes of Harvard University. Representatives of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Harvard School of Public Health, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Harvard Divinity School, and the Harvard School of Business all joined forces at the Kumbh in an interdisciplinary manner with students from these schools on sites to study the Mela. The accommodations, as you briefly saw in the film, that incredible tent, were high and set on a hill overlooking the Kumbh, and the showers had hot and cold water day and night, and the tents were extremely comfortably appointed. The aim of the study was to explore this extreme temporal of the Kumbh landscape, showing that much was to be learned about planning and design, flow management, peaceful movement of crowds in millions that seem to have no problem getting around, infrastructural deployment, such as sanitation, waste disposal, to clean water drinking, and a system of food whereby all the pilgrims ate 3 cooked meals a day effortlessly. The professors explored cultural identity and elasticity in an urban condition, and the interdisciplinary analysis for such a special phenomenon threw light on the great collaboration between the state government of India, the akhadas, the religious akhadas or sects, and the devotees who contributed by way of food or transport or cash to make the arrangements complete. The night we arrived, Professor Diana Eck was leading a group to a sundown puja. We promptly joined and went down and sat in a temple where a puja was performed to the tinkling of thousands of bells from simultaneous sundown pujas that were being performed at the Kumbh that evening. I remember closing my eyes and the extreme spiritual experience and the energy of millions of people praying together simultaneously washed over me immediately. The day after a vegetarian breakfast and excellent masala tea, we went with Professor Rahul Mehrotra, who was mapping the Mela with the expertise of digital kite cameras that flew over the entire Mela, showing a grid of how the spaces were organized. He explained that the more established akhadas had the better and larger spaces, and others according to their date and lineage. Professor Diana Eck was also with us this morning with her group, and Meera Hewitt, who is right here from SAI. Professor Eck had set up a rare private audience with Baba Rampuri, a Californian native who is the only non-Indian to be accepted into and run his own akhada in India. As we walked through the streets with several naked, and might I add, beautiful yogi bodies of Babas smeared with ash, we arrived at Baba Rampuri's, where he spoke about how the system worked. He also imparted some wisdom in parting, saying, "We are on this journey through time and space, and the only way to get the best out of it, life's run, was by staying connected to the universe through mantra and chanting, so as to be in regular tune with the vibration of the earth." He also said that correct sattvic foods, vegetarian fruit and roots, and regular fasting brings back correct thinking, and yoga was the only way to inner life and space. With these nuggets of thoughts, we went back to the settlement in the hill, where every evening groups gathered in the tent to share their findings with all. This was always the highlight of my day. The charts and the presentations every evening made the Mela clearer and clearer each day. I must add that my existentialism chats with the peaceful Professor Parimal Patel and his group from the School of Divinity about the impact of scripture on social behavior was truly fascinating. On the third day, late into the evening, we went with Professor Rich from the School of Public Policy and his team of students to examine sanitation. The portable bathrooms were very clean, and there were hundreds of them lined along the sandbanks of the Ganges, complete with sinks and basins for washing hands. The excrement was biodisposed by chemicals that reduced the waste to a mere nothing. It was heartening to see technology used in such fashion at the Kumbh. The mobile phone grid with millions of cell phones and the central lost and found person system I found remarkable too. Finally, the most popular blog of the Kumbh experience. A dip in the Ganges with a Harvard professor took place, yes, with us. Kashyap, Vikram, and I were on our way to dip in the Ganges on day 5 when we spotted Professor Macumber in the tent working feverishly at 11 a.m. on his laptop. I asked him if he would like to go with us, and he seemed doubtful, but then agreed. "Let me get my towel and I'll be right back," he said. And with that, we took a boat and we were rowing out into the middle of the river, which was a little less crowded. A puja was performed, and with that, we all jumped into the Ganges. The dip was fantastic, fresh, and quite simply amazing. But I think it was John Macumber who got the most out of the dip experience, and I was so happy that we could all share that exquisite moment together. We left with much love and respect for the dedication and the brilliance of the entire experience of the Harvard team. And the Giving Back Foundation and Vikram and I are delighted to sponsor the Kumbh book, which is here, and also the traveling exhibit. Also the shirt I'm wearing today, I bought at the Kumbh, so I'm really glad to put it to good use. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist. This script is a little smaller, so I have to use my glasses. Is Professor Rahul Mehrotra, Professor of Urban Design and Planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Rahul Mehrotra is a professor of urban design. He is a practicing architect, urban designer, and educator. His firm, RMA Architects, was founded in 1990 in Mumbai, and he has designed and executed projects for clients that include government and non-governmental agencies, corporate as well as private individuals and institutions. Mehrotra has written and lectured extensively on issues to do with architecture, conservation, and urban planning in Mumbai and India. He has long been involved in civic and urban affairs in Mumbai, having served on commissions for the conservation of historic books and environmental issues. In fact, his coffee table book, which he produced several years ago, is still the most widely read book on the subject. His current research involves looking at India's medium-sized cities and the broader emergent patterns of urbanism in India. Mehrotra's ongoing research is focused on evolving a theoretical framework for designing conditions of informal growth, what he refers to as the kinetic city. He has run several studios looking at various impacts of planning questions in the city of Mumbai under the rubric of extreme urbanism. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Rahul Mehrotra. Right here.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Meera. Thanks for all your support on this project. And it's great to be here at the Asia Society and share with you the work that we've been doing. So, to just jump into this, for the Kumbh Mela, we really had two goals when we formulated the project. The first was to look at the Kumbh as an urban system, because we felt that this framework of urbanism would allow these different disciplines to kind of nestle within this larger rubric. But more importantly, we did a literature survey on the Kumbh, and what was fascinating was there were really three kinds of books or literature on it. One was scholarly stuff that came out of the University of Wisconsin, largely American and German universities, which was focused scholarship on gender issues or politics and patronage, wonderful sort of very intense kinds of studies. The second was maybe 4 or 5 books by administrators who had run the Kumbh, and these were good records but not systematic, largely sort of talking about their own experiences. And the third, which was the largest body of literature, 20s or 30 books, were photographers, because this is it's a visual spectacle, and photography sort of lends itself to capturing something like this. But there'd been nothing that looked at this systematically as an urban system, as a megacity, because 7 million people lived there permanently for 55 days, besides the many who sort of visited. So that was really one intent. The other, from a pedagogical perspective in a university setting, was that it was such an out-of-the-box problem that it was perfect for interdisciplinary work. And in hindsight, I think the success of this as an interdisciplinary project was because it was so out of the box that no one had preconceptions about what they would expect there. So the design school students had no idea how you'd settle a city like that. Similarly, public health, my God, how would you manage so many people? And so people dependent on each other intellectually as they went through this project. So I think just as a sorry, how does this? I did something terrible. Okay. The other question, of course, was what can we learn from the Kumbh for our cities, for rapid deployment, for ephemeral landscapes, which is, I think, what is the most interesting aspect, at least for me, is that on the planet today, it's amazing how many ephemeral or temporary settlements occur for celebration, And of course, refugee camps and disasters responses, those are all the obvious ones. But the two extremes are ones for celebration, which are therapeutic for societies in some ways. And the other extreme of that temporal scale is the sites of extraction. Because even mining towns, they have an expiration date. And so this is fascinating if you ask the question, because we take permanence as such a given condition when we think of urbanism. But if you ask the question, how would you design a settlement with an expiration date? It opens up, a million questions which are absolutely fascinating. And so this was one very important aspect of kind of the intellectual project here, which is what led to this interdisciplinary kind of project where we had a roster of questions and we had these many schools coming from different disciplines asking the questions about religion, about urbanism, about business, about technology. This was the first Kumbh where cell phones were used to the extent they were. This will be a big question for 12 years later. Health questions, governance, engineering, because it's a feat of engineering in some ways. And this was the group that went there. We were 40 people, including faculty and students who sort of spent time there in this sort of interdisciplinary formation. And that's the city that you see on a grid, which I'll just come to. We also dwelled into the archives, which was fascinating because till quite recently, till the late 1800s or the early 1900s, it was a chaotic affair. People gathered, millions of people gathered, and I think when the British arrived there and must have seen this big gathering and were kind of paranoid that there was going to be a revolution, somebody took it upon themselves to order this thing. And this is what it looked like, and that bridge you'll see in later slides, you can see then a rationality brought to it in terms of discipline of planning. And this is a typical town planning kind of plan that the British sort of evolved. This is 54, where it was a very simple grid which they laid out, but they began to rationalize the processes, who had a bath first, who moved out of which part of which sector first, the whole circulation, to manage it in more rational terms. And this kind of plan evolved in the simplistic way as a grid. Then it became zones with the coming of Chandigarh, because you had sectors in that kind of urban plan that Corbusier did, so it became a kind of sectorial planning kind of move. But essentially, this is a city, or a megacity, an ephemeral megacity, that is constructed at the confluence of these two rivers on the banks of the sand. That means the banks of the river when the river sort of recedes. In terms of scale, that's what it is. This is when the grid gets laid onto it. With Manhattan, that's the comparison in relation to Manhattan, which you'll relate to. So it would go all the way up beyond Central Park. That's the scale of it. What you see in the red outline is the extent of the city. This is an image we took when we went there in August. The river was yet full. You can see the trace of a road from the previous 12 years. We went back to the same spot in January because the whole city is constructed in 6 weeks. And from the same spot, the same tree, that's what unfolded as an entire organism in the period of 6 weeks. So it really sits at this confluence. It's an ever-shifting kind of landscape because every year the river settles differently. We created the spatially kind of referenced database of about 10,000 images, which we are hoping we can evolve a way of making more public. It's all spatially kind of correlated, and from that is a whole catalog of images of different activities, of people, of markets, of food places, etc. We also did Google Street Views, so we mounted a camera on a car, and we've done Google Street Views of the entire Kumbh. And, Meera talked about the camera with the digital, the kite with the digital cameras, but really the reason for that was the government didn't give us permission for drones, but there was no law that prevented you by, flying a kite. And so we actually documented, this is Dinesh Mehta, a photographer friend, who came along with us and documented the city from 12 fixed points, and we documented it for a year from the construction of the city to the dismantling of the city from the fixed points. So these are all before and after. These are exactly from the same positions which were established on the terrain. It's exactly the same position. So you see how when the river recedes, the city sort of evolves on the banks. These are all exactly the same positions. And this is the confluence where people bathe, and that's why there's such there's so much open space, because this is where about 10 or 15 million people sort of go through at different times. And that's how when the city gets settled. What's interesting is it's a very robust grid. Every road in the grid goes across as a pontoon bridge, so that it's, in terms of circulation, absolutely efficient. These are the kinds of detail images of the different akhadas. So there's a kind of square there. This is a grid. It's a perfect grid. And in each one of these, people organize themselves differently depending on their own beliefs and faith. They have their own implicit rules by which these are centrally or internally organized. There's also a fascinating aspect about its connection to the regional systems in terms of material geography, where the material comes from, and then at the end of the Mela, the material gets recycled in the terrain, in the region. The bridges go to little villages, the light posts, the pipes, it all gets recycled in that geography. And this is something we didn't study in enough detail, and something that's, I think, open for research later, the material geography. But this is the river in flood. And after the monsoon in October, it recedes and the kind of sand emerges. So they only have 6 weeks to really imagine the river. That's where the grid becomes very efficient. You just point the grid on it, and depending on what the shape of the terrain is, because every road goes across, it becomes an extremely robust grid that sort of goes across this. So it's a shifting context, but a very abstract tool of the grid which sits on it to construct this city. And here you see every road has a bridge that goes across it. If you go and zoom in, it's very robust just in terms of its circulation. And this is what the pontoon bridges look like. We also digitized this from Google Images. So we actually, 3 students almost went blind over a whole summer doing this. But we actually have every tent mapped. I'm sorry, this resolution is not very good, which means you can actually take density readings. You can do all sorts of speculative studies in the future for now. One of the most interesting things for me as being an architect, and we were studying it really from the physical form, is we found, and this was one of those eureka moments, where we found that the entire city, this entire city of 7 million people, everything which was habitable was made out of only 5 materials, which was 8-foot-long bamboo as a modular, nails or screws, string or coir, corrugated metal sheets, and some form of skin, textile, or plastic. These were the 5 materials that the entire city was made out of. So you can see it's a whole array of tents going up to different scales. We mapped them all just to prove that this was correct. It goes up to this kind of scale. It gets clad in cloth. It becomes community centers and performance places. But it's all the same 5 materials. It's decorated. These are real places. This is one difference from refugee camps, because this is a settlement for celebration and religion. There are a lot of community spaces here that bring people together. But you look at the scale, it's all the same materials. And look at the scale of this. It's all the same materials. There are no other materials that come in. Security is very intelligent, very invisible. It's on a grid. The grid is about 10,000 square feet. One person is allocated to the 10,000 square feet. They become part of the community and keep their eye on everything using cell phones. And it was very, very efficient in the way it happened. But essentially, it is a festival. It is the largest Hindu congregation in the world. It is about religion. It is about these great priests who people come to meet and to take their blessings. The statistics are mind-boggling in terms of any real city. It's bigger than any, the usual small towns that we see. It is a mega city. And I think all aspects, whether you look at infrastructure, there are 10,500 sweepers that keep it clean. I think it was the cleanest Indian city I've seen, and I've seen a lot of them. Hospitals with social infrastructure, that's what the streets look like. Every akhada, which means every one of those communities I showed you, have their own expression in terms of their entrance points. The other fascinating thing here, and I'm just sharing with you 2 or 3 things that I think are very, very important for the future, and of course Tarun and the others will talk about other aspects, but governance. This is a chart that shows every character that was involved in the planning and the execution of the Kumbh Mela and the relationships, how they relate to each other. What's fascinating is the first year, before they implement on the ground, it's a top-down system with the chief minister, the chief secretary. It happens in Lucknow. It goes through a kind of bureaucracy. And this begins to shift. You start seeing the power centers shifting depending on the stage. Then bureaucrats get involved at another point. But then at implementation, the whole power structure flips to the bottom of that circle. And so there is a completely different governance system for the implementation with its own power structure, which allows them then to go outside that circle for subcontracting, for roads, for tents, etc. Now, this is fascinating because it tells you two things. One is that policy and implementation are two things, and you need different people. We often have the same characters doing both, and not efficiently. And that's one problem. The second question it opens up for us to reflect upon is when we talk about temporality, it's not just a matter of plastic sheets and temporary looking things, but even governance can be actually imagined on a temporal scale, where this person who becomes in charge, the man you see in the picture, he has the powers for 6 months, the powers of a district magistrate, which means he can call the army in if there's unrest. But it's a suspended power only for that period of time with very specific tasks. So this idea of even looking at governance on this kind of temporal scale, for me, is very fascinating when we look at refugee camps and we look at other such temporary settlements. And so that's how it all sort of comes together. These are the stages. They even the road out and flatten it. The government does it. The streets come in. The light systems are put in. It's electricity right through the whole settlement. Then the different groups take it over. They have their own ways of subdividing it into transcribing the grid. They make the land sacred, so they go through the ritual. Then they divide it again, subdivide it based on the sects, and then they begin to occupy it. And then you have the construction of the city, its decoration, the fabric comes on, the tents arrive, people begin to stitch things together, the water supply. So once the land is flattened and the terrain ready, people begin to occupy it while the government in the grid puts in the infrastructure, the sanitation that Meera was sort of talking about. It's all piped water supply and sewage. It's absolutely amazing that it's all done in 6 weeks, and the whole city sort of unfolds in front of you with their own sort of images and definitions. The processions occur, people occupy it, the big priests come in, the big sort of rituals happen on those 5 days that are sacred, offerings are made to the holy river, and then it's demolished. 1 week after it's over, people disappear and it's dismantled. This is a week from the same kite, images we took a week after the Kumbh Mela, and you have only remnants of the tents. You have footprints of where the tents were, where people left their thatch bedding, in a sense. So it's kind of footprints. And you see there's little bit, some rubble that lies around, little objects that have been left, sacred objects, and that's sort of the terrain. What is fascinating is this happens in March. The monsoon arrives in June. The farmers productively use the grid because they have 2 months. The territory has been gridded and subdivided. So the farmers from the local areas, they move in. The cows have come in, and they actually have a crop in those 2 months using the flattened terrain and using the fact that the delineation of land has been rationalized. And so it makes it sort of easy for them to administer. And the land doesn't even lie fallow for those 2 months till, of course, finally the river swells again in the monsoon and it floods. So basically we looked at pilgrimage, religious studies, design, business, engineering, governance, technology, which my colleagues will sort of will share with you. We also sort of looked at this really as an urban system. We looked at public-private relationships because this is a very good example of public-private partnerships because the grid is set out by the government with the infrastructure, but the self-organization occurs within each sector in an incredibly efficient way. I think for the future, the question of material geographies would be a fascinating study for someone to do, to look at what might be possibilities in 12 years for energy, because energy is a big suck here. They depend on the grid of the larger state. Disposal, sanitation, flushing, the waste eventually, I think has a lot of potential. It isn't sort of all there yet. Information technology, which Tarun will talk about, I think how it can be leveraged, massive possibilities. And, you know, besides all this sort of technology that I'm alluding to, it's amazing when this happens that this place, it leaves no memory. What is left is finally a kind of image, a virtual imagination of what was there because there's no trace left there. And this moment became very clear to me because we were there for 8 days obsessed with the technical aspects of the city. And on the last day, I went to thank a sadhvi, a woman priest, senior person, who had helped us tremendously with the arrangements, and I went to seek her blessings. And what she looked at me and she put her hand on my head as a gesture of blessing me, and she said, "Feel blessed that the Mother Ganges allowed you to sit in her lap for a few days." Thank you very much.
Amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, I told you were in for a treat. It's just like such an incredible, incredible phenomenon. Our next panelist is Dhruv Kazi, Assistant Professor, Department of Medicine, Cardiology, Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, and Center for Healthcare Value, University of California in San Francisco. Dhruv Kazi is Assistant Professor in the Department of Medicine and also a physician in the Division of Cardiology at the San Francisco General Hospital. He is particularly interested in understanding and improving long-term clinical outcomes amongst patients with cardiovascular disease in the United States and overseas, as well as the optimization of healthcare expenditure to maximize societal value. He has co-founded HEART MAP, a low-cost, data-driven program focused on improving medication and medical adherence amongst low-literacy patients with advanced cardiovascular disease. HeartMap harnesses technology and real-time data analysis to treat and track patients on anticoagulation using financial and non-financial incentives for stakeholder behavior modification. HeartMap partners with Narayana Hospitals in Bangalore, a pioneer in using industrial systems to design dramatically and reduce the cost of cardiovascular surgery. He is also associated with the Center for Chronic Disease Control in New Delhi, India's leading private-public partnership for research in non-communicable diseases. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Dhruv Kazi.
Hi, everyone. It's about as intimidating as it can get to follow Rahul's presentation. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack and talk about healthcare at the Mela. I want to thank the Asia Society. It's my first time here. I'm also an Asia 21 fellow from the class of 2013, which is an organization that brings together people from around the world, and it's been quite an exciting experience. Some of the work with HeartMap that you heard about has been, I've had great assistance from folks I met through the Asia Society, so thank you. How do I move this? That's not it. Okay, so you've seen a lot of the slides. I'm going to dive straight into the healthcare issues around the Kumbh. I do want to give you a scale of this gathering just because the numbers are so impressive, you often lose sense of the scale. We think of the Hajj as being one of the largest mass gatherings. There are great visuals we get from the Hajj. And the Kumbh, at its most conservative estimates, is about 27 times the size of the Hajj. And then you saw Rahul talk about Manhattan. My part of the world, the reference is slightly different. You think about Burning Man. He showed the slide. It's about 3 times the size of Burning Man in terms of geography, but by population is about 1,600 times. So again, the challenge when it comes to thinking about healthcare at the Kumbh is on a different scale than what we're used to thinking about. With health, there are 2 aspects that we want to think about. We want to think about public health aspects, meaning people come in, they're healthy, how are we going to keep them healthy? And then the clinical aspects or healthcare aspects, saying folks will get sick if they spend 55 days in such crowded environments, and how are we going to help them if they get sick? But the bigger question is to step back and say, why do this at all? why study a system that is so ephemeral, as Rahul described? And there are two reasons to do so. One is because this is an opportunity to understand what works and what does not work at the Kumbh, and therefore improve upon it at future iterations of the Kumbh. But more importantly, what insights can we gather from here that we can apply to other settings? And it's that latter aspect that I hope that we can bring out perhaps in the panel discussion. So again, very large, we're going to talk about both the public health aspects, how do we keep people safe, and the clinical health aspects, how do you get people better if they're if they get unwell. So briefly touching on the public health aspects, there are huge dimensions to this. The big one, of course, when you think of crowds this size, is crowd mitigation. Stampede is a huge risk when you bring 30 million people together on one day to have a bath in the Sangam. And we've seen stampedes more recently at far more organized events like the Hajj, which is, has a permanent infrastructure that they've invested a ton of money in. So how does the Kumbh, by and large, avoid issues related to stampedes? We'll talk briefly about water and sanitation. You can imagine that that's an enormous challenge. And then I'll talk about epidemic surveillance, which ties into the clinical health aspects of the Kumbh. So you saw Rahul talk about the grid, and it turns out this is the single biggest intervention for stampede prevention, which is you have a street, and if you're on a street, it's one way, and it will keep going. If the river comes in the way, there's a bridge across it, and then you get on the other side. So essentially, there is the turbulence of people that is the primary cause of stampedes. When people meet at angles, it just doesn't happen. These bridges are one way. You start on one side, you can just keep going till you reach the other end of the Kumbh. And this is non-trivial on the busiest days. When this is at the Moni Amavasya, which is the biggest bathing day. Best estimates are about 30 million people got into the water that day. This is important. There's a pontoon bridge. It goes one way. And when you get to the end of the bridge, you are told whether you're going left or right. And you follow them. And then there are aspects that actually are better seen in some of Rahul's pictures. But again, panic is the second driver of stampedes. And so what they had done is staged these huge bathing areas. So you got there, you changed, you got into the water. There was someone keeping an eye on you, practically timing you as to how long you were in the water. There were boats in the water to make sure you didn't get too far and got into trouble in that fashion. And then you came out and you were out. Again, you got on a bridge and it took you back home. Again, this is non-trivial because mass gatherings that are far smaller in India have a much worse track record of stampedes. And so it's amazing. They did have a stampede. It was within the Mela. It was 3 people died. But again, which is terrible. But again, to get a sense of the scale of crowd management here is pretty impressive, given that all of this is ephemeral. I want to talk about water and sanitation, and I'll come back. We saw Rahul mention that it's piped water, there's tons of access to clean drinking water, even the sewage is piped out, and there are extensive mechanisms. But you can imagine putting so many people in close proximity and providing food in this setting is a setup for infectious disease. So when we talk about epidemic surveillance, we went in with the idea that we were looking for infectious diseases. And again, this is from Moni Amavasya, from the tower, you get a sense of how you manage these folks. So now let's talk about the clinical care part. So, so we talked about public health, now I'm moving to clinical care. The clinical care piece is interesting because, as Rahul mentioned, there are 7 million people who are there for the duration, but most people, the median visit is about a day and a half. You come in, you take your dip, and you leave. There's no disposable income here. You can't just hang out and celebrate. You're here for a purpose. You take your dip and you leave. And the government invests in this infrastructure where there is a central hospital which is a 100-bed hospital, has an ICU, has some basic imaging and testing facilities. And then a bunch of spokes go out from that hub where there are 13 peripheral hospitals or sector hospitals. And a sector hospital looks something like this. There's a clinic that's staffed 24/7. There are physicians there. Each sector hospital, doesn't matter where they are, have 2 physicians on duty. And this is important because they don't quite track utilization. Some sector hospitals see about 6 times as many people as other hospitals, but you still have 2 physicians, and if you're stuck there for the month, that's a lot of work. You wait in line, you get seen, there's no expectation of privacy, there's no real physical exam or blood work happening. You tell them you have a cold, you get some medications. And again, this is a function, I'm not being critical here, I'm describing the process because it ties into what we're hoping to do next. And you get a sense, there is a blood pressure cuff there, but there's not enough time to check blood pressure on these folks, and I'll talk to you about that. There's an inpatient 20-bed unit at each of these peripheral hospitals that was mostly unused because folks are again, coming in, they're largely healthy, they get some medications, and you walk in and you almost invariably, meaning 99 out of 100, will get at least 2 prescriptions. They're filled at the local pharmacy, you get 2 days worth of medicines and they're free. There's an ambulance with a stampede kit and burn kit, and these ambulances are basically brought in from neighboring towns with their drivers for the duration of the Kumbh. And it was amazing how well equipped these ambulances are. The challenge is, on the day of the Kumbh, I was part of a medical response to a guy who passed out and almost certainly had a heart attack. But there was nowhere for the ambulance to go. I mean, we were in this road management, we were stuck in traffic for about 45 minutes for what was probably about a mile. But again, even the fact that there is an equipped ambulance is a scale up over the vast majority of Indian cities. So again, putting this in perspective, a lot of effort had gone into building the system. But there were unanswered questions. What are these people, what are the medications that are being given out? What are the conditions that are being treated? And is there something we can do to optimize this resource allocation? So one of the things that I do, I'm a cardiologist, but I'm also a health economist, and I like to think about how resources are allocated. And this is the extent of the record keeping. It's handwritten. I felt pretty comfortable that this was not a HIPAA or privacy violation because you can't actually read anything on here. But they have stacks of them. And so someone's trying to keep records, but these paper records mean you cannot analyze them. You have no idea what's actually happening in real time or even afterwards. And so the idea, and I should clarify here, this project was led by Sajid Balsari at Cornell and Jennifer Leaning at the Harvard School of Public Health. I came on as the kind of the outcomes researcher, the health economist, and so I'm the data geek, but the original ideas came from the group at Cornell and HSPH, where if you have a tool that would capture these data and somehow upload them to the cloud, very literally, and analyze them, we could get data in a more meaningful, timely fashion. I came in as the resident skeptic. I didn't think it was doable, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised with what we found. So again, a referral hospital, peripheral hospitals, we sampled 5 hospitals, and because there was clearly not enough manpower to manage all the data coming through. And so essentially what it looked like was there was a team of medical students, public health students from local universities who joined this endeavor. And what they would do is they would take that sheet of paper and they would log it. And it was just a very simple click interface on iPads that were rented for almost nothing. And the software itself, this is the interesting part, was we built this in less than a week using custom off-the-shelf stuff that you can order, survey tools, etc. And we were so proud of ourselves. We had the survey, we show up on day one, realized it was completely useless. And so this goes back to the idea of human-centered design, where we then basically said, let's treat this as the prototype. And within a week, quick, rapid prototyping, we had gotten to something where it would take less than a minute per record. And that's, when you're trying to enter tens of thousands of data points, every click counts. So optimizing that so that the formulary is built in, the most common medications show up on top, etc., were critical to making this happen. And here's what we got. Within 2 weeks of data collection, we had 49,000 unique patient-physician interactions. This is crazy in terms of scale. Like, this would take me 4 years in San Francisco. And it's not just about the numbers, because even very simple dives into the data yield insights that we did not have previously. I'll give you an example. If you look at gender, so at the Kumbh, about 40% of the attendees of the pilgrims are women, between 40 and 50%. It's fairly gender balanced. But when you look at the peripheral hospitals, only a quarter of the patients are women. And we're like, well, what's happening here? Is there a perceived barrier? And that goes back to the idea there are male physicians, there's no privacy. And quite really, the issue is that if you're a woman, you're afraid of getting separated from the rest of your family while you're there. So unless someone's going with you to the clinic, you're not going. In contrast, in the central hospital, where there was a women's clinic and there were female doctors and there was some modicum of privacy, you see that the gender balance reappears. So again, thinking about, hey, if we're actually trying to serve the pilgrims, then the setup we have in these 13 peripheral hospitals is not working. The median age was 50, which is, again, a little surprising to me. I'd expected it to be older. We think of Kumbh as an older population. And this was our hypothesis as to what we were going to see. We expected to see a lot of diarrhea. And this is what we saw. Diarrhea was extremely uncommon in this population. And we have a few hypotheses as to why that might be. Of course, this pipe water, this pipe sanitation, a lot of thought has gone into preventing enteric diseases or communicable diseases. And then, of course, there's a possibility that people were not reporting for diarrhea, but the fact is they're reporting for pretty much everything else, given how the care is free, and this is a medically underserved population. So the idea of seeing a doctor, even just getting any attention for your complaints is attractive. So people are coming in. It's just that diarrhea is uncommon. What is more common is upper respiratory symptoms. You're in this cold environment, there's no way to wash hands, it's crowded, and the smog is settling down on the Kumbh. It's the respiratory stuff. And so in the future, that's something where we'd have to monitor very closely because this is perfectly set up for a flu outbreak or something more serious. Something that, again, blew our mind, if you walked into one of these clinics, there was a 30% chance that you were going to walk out with antibiotics. Now, again, it's more than a fun fact. Antibiotic resistance is actually one of the biggest healthcare issues in the world today. And a lot of it is these folks who have never been exposed to antibiotics are coming in, getting a 2-day supply of antibiotics and going back to their villages. So they're not only developing antibiotic resistance, they're taking it back into their town. So this is, again, an opportunity for quality improvement. This is all comers. If you came in and said you had a fever, you had more than a 60% chance of getting an antibiotic prescription. And then again, this is the temporal pattern where you see around February 10th was one of the biggest bathing days, and you can see that obviously the clinic visits spike along there as well. And then this is the idea saying that if you now, because we are capturing these symptoms, we have the ability to track the individual complaints. So you can see here that cough, there's all these symptoms that are being followed. Here's a thought I want to tell you. If you're an epidemiologist, what you're looking for is to say, hey, yesterday I had 2 cases of cough, and today I have 4. Maybe there's an outbreak of cough in the community. But if you're an epidemiologist at the Kumbh, you have no idea whether now you have 4 cases because your population has doubled, right? There's no fixed denominator, and this is the challenge with mass gatherings, it's the challenge with refugee camps. There's no good way to do surveillance because you don't have a denominator. You have no idea how many people are actually served by your clinic. And so the idea that the project that we're now working on is to say differential slopes. If the population doubles, basically everything should go up to twice the number as was previously observed. But here you see around February 10th that there is a spike in musculoskeletal pain, fever, and upper respiratory symptoms. This was an outbreak of an upper respiratory viral illness, and this is something that should have been tracked. This could have been worse. Of course, we had insight. We all got sick that day, and so we knew this was going around. But again, to see it in the population was interesting. Okay, so I'm going to close here with saying that with regards to healthcare, you can have very useful data hidden in plain sight. And this is the first time with the availability of extremely inexpensive mobile technology, we have the ability to process these data quickly, even in low resource settings. This entire project with the data collection and analysis was under $2,000. Yeah, that includes the rental, the analysis, everything, and 49,000 data points. And then it may help epidemic surveillance and resource utilization. I've been told that the best way to end a talk that is going to lead into a panel discussion is to feed questions to the audience. And so I'm going to do that. And this is what I would like us to think about. What are the insights here that can be used at other mass gatherings? And then thinking beyond mass gatherings, but thinking about long-term care, particularly cardiovascular care. And here's food for thought. Half the people that you've seen in all of these photographs are going to die of heart disease. Should this be an opportunity for us to make some interventions, or at least think about what we would do the next time the Kumbh comes along? I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
That was brilliant. And I actually, one of the evenings when I was sitting at the tent, Professor Rich's group was talking about the diarrhea issue. And I think one of the conclusions was that all the food that's sent is fresh. The farmers send their very best produce to the Kumbh in the service of God and humanity. 3 fresh meals are made 3 times a day with devotees and volunteers. So the food is very, very fresh. It's vegetarian. And I don't know how they do it because you know which temples are serving food at what time. And we reached, I think Tarun was with us, we reached one temple at 1:15 and the feeding was 12 to 1. And there was not a chapati left. I mean, they just, I don't know how they make just the right amount. So there's no waste of food. The last and most wonderful panelist is Professor Tarun Khanna. He is the director of the South Asia Institute at Harvard. He is the George Paulo Lemann Professor at Harvard Business School. He has studied and worked with entrepreneurs and investors in emerging markets worldwide. He was named Harvard University's Director of South Asia Institute in the fall of 2010. He joined the HBS faculty in 1993 after obtaining an engineering degree from Princeton in 1988 and a PhD from Harvard in 1993 with an interim stint on Wall Street. During this time, he has served as the head of several courses on strategy, corporate governance, international business, targeted to MBA students and senior executives alike. He currently teaches in Harvard College's undergraduate general education core curriculum at the university, and also a course on entrepreneurship in developing countries and at HBS. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Tarun Khanna.
Thank you, Meera. Thank you very much for your generosity, and the Asia Society also. Wow, you really can't see anything from here because the lights are in your eyes. Well, I made an executive decision to not use my presentation because we're quite a bit behind time, and I thought I would just make a few points that I think, after listening to Rahul and Dhruv so eloquently describe and show you so many pictures, many of the pictures are overlapping, and I think I'll be able to free ride on their imagery to make a few very simple points. The first is really a question to ask you. Both Rahul, actually Meera as well, but Rahul and Dhruv started, or at some point said, this is the biggest collection of humanity. How do we know that? Anyone want to shout out an answer? How do we know that this is the biggest collection of humanity? Or how do we know that there's 30 million people, or 80, or 120, and if you look at the press, you have every possible number thrown out there. Anyone shout out? Yeah, go ahead. Density within the grid. How do we get the density within the grid? You count one grid and then you extrapolate out, or you take imagery, maybe you take Rahul's kites and you kind of estimate and so on. You could also do things like count the number of people coming in across the different bridges as they come into the this temporary pop-up megacity, and so on and so forth. Well, but the reality is that almost none of that is done. But people come up with these hocus-pocus estimates, and so you have wide ranges from something to something. So one of the tasks that, so my background is in applied mathematics, and one of the tasks that I was really fascinated by when this project first came across our collective desk was, it would be nice to know how many people were actually there, so that we don't keep banding these estimates around. So I teamed up with a mathematician who likes playing with large data sets, and we convinced India's largest cell phone provider, since this is the cell phone Kumbh, this is the first time there's cell phones at the Kumbh, we convinced the largest provider, Bharti, to let us have access to the data. Now, that was an adventure in itself, because it turned out that the government of India thought that this was inimical to its own national security, and it would not let us access the data. And Harvard University thought that this was going to violate all sorts of privacy norms. And I tried so hard to reassure everybody that the sadhu didn't really care whether I had access to, whether he called another sadhu or not, but to no avail. So the long and short is we ended up with this convoluted thing that took 9 months, after which we got some version of the data that was physically resident in New Delhi in a secure location, policed by the government of India. I had somebody sitting in Cambridge with a high-speed computer actually picking up the phone and giving instructions to the guy on the other end saying, now code this to get it. That's how bad the infrastructure was. But we did it anyway. And we got a data set of about 400 million communication events, right? A large data set, 4 million communication events. And from that, we're able to basically back into some sorts of estimates of how many people actually came to the Kumbh. And our sort of answer was, so in math, since these are still estimates at the end of the day, we were able to come up with an estimate that said that the lower bound, right, is about 72 million cumulative attendance at the Kumbh. Right? So in other words, we don't know, in mathematics you'd say we don't know how tight that bound is. In other words, we know that it's more than 72 million for sure, almost for sure, but we don't know whether it's 95 or 105, but we can tell you it's not lower than 70 million. Right? So that's the first precise estimate. So that's pretty big anyway. And in fact, the peak morning of Amavasya day on February 10th, that was about 30 million was the lower bound. So it was more than 30 million on that day, which is extraordinary. It's the size of Central Park and then some, and 30 million people on that Central Park location trying to do whatever it is that they do. So that's the first exercise that we did. That's a paper that will be published in one of these technical journals. The second thing was to sort of build on my colleague Sachit, who's not here, and Dhruv and Jennifer and all these doctors and public health people, to build on them. So my other hat outside of Harvard is I'm an entrepreneur and I build companies, mostly in developing countries. And there's one company that I co-founded some years ago called Janacare, which is a diabetes management company. Now, Dhruv ended his talk with a lovely transition to say, shouldn't we be doing something about cardiac disease? And the correlate, of course, to cardiac disease is rampant diabetes, particularly for, I think, Indian males like me and some people in this room who seem to be genetically predisposed to this for some reason. So we instituted with my company, which actually has devised, I'm reaching for my phone, has devised a very low-cost method, completely novel intellectual property, to measure instantly certain correlates of diabetes, certain measures that even today in Manhattan you wouldn't be able to get very easily. You'd have to go to a doctor and they'd tell you after 48 hours, but we can get it instantly on any cheap cell phone, extremely, extremely, extremely cheaply. So this is a game changer if in fact we're correct. But the nice thing is that with the same team, at one of the subsequent Kumbh Melas, which just concluded in Nasik, which is a tiny Kumbh Mela in comparison. So if the lower bound for Allahabad was, 2 years ago was 72 million, our lower bound at Nasik was probably 25 million. So it's still biggish, 25 million, right? But it's not as big as Allahabad. We were able to institute the first systemic collection of data for chronic diabetes and produce India's first diabetes heat map, just as a demonstration effect. So I think the public health, as well as the, what do you call them? It's not public health, interventional? Whatever, after you get sick, right? Both after you get sick and before you get sick, implications of this are pretty amazing. So that was the second project we were engaged in, to couple with the infectious disease and the preventive type of stuff. The third project that I was fortunate enough to be involved with, one of my colleagues was on that video that we started off with. John McComber is in his second career as a professor at Harvard Business School. In his first career, he's an incredibly successful real estate investor. So John and I teamed up to say, how do we understand the real estate aspects of this? What does it actually take? And Rahul talked about the governance structures and so on and so forth. The coolest thing about the organization of the Kumbh Mela was that the government of India did not do what the government of India usually does, which is mess it up. And the government of India actually stepped back and took a deep, hard look at itself and said, what can we actually do? Well, not much. We can do a few things, credibly. We'd like to be able to do more. We just don't have the state capacity. So the government of India, or its representatives, that Rahul put up some of the images of the wonderful people who actually administered the Kumbh, took an extremely realistic assessment of what they could and could not deliver, committed to some pretty minimalist platform-like structures, and you saw the physical manifestation of this in the grid, but even on other dimensions. So one of the things that we do in the lovely book that Meera was introducing and so kindly sponsored, one of the chapters in there lays out, here are a list of things that the government explicitly committed not to do. And my view is that that is the single reason, structural reason, why this actually worked, which is a realistic assessment of what actually can be delivered in a very short period of time under incredibly constrained circumstances, and then a willingness to partner with all sorts of other civil society, private sector entrepreneurs, even academics. I mean, for them to be receptive, thanks to Rahul and Diana's and other people's outreach for many months before the Kumbh actually started, for them to be receptive to the Harvard University showing up and saying, we want a Kumbh Mela tent, is pretty incredible. So it shows their openness, and my hat's off to the team for pulling this off. I started off by being facetious about the government. I'm very involved with the governments. I don't mean to beat up on my own country's government, but the reality is that state capacity, what political scientists call state capacity, is pretty minimal in most poor countries, including in my own, in India. And so I think it's better when you have a realistic sense of what you can deliver, and then lay out what business people would call some key performance indicators, and then live by them and be governed by them. And that's what we pulled off. So, I guess my own involvement in this is a little bit of a microcosm of what Rahul and Dhruv and others were talking about. We tried to bring people together. So I teamed up with the doctors, I teamed up with the real estate investor, and I teamed up with a mathematician to deliver 3 different pieces of work. And that's what you saw in this book. And I'll stop with that without showing you any pictures, and see if we can start our panel. Yes? Come. Thank you very much.
So these are on?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm here. Can you hear me? Yes. So there are microphones in the audience, and we're going to go to the audience. There was one question tweeted to us, actually from a Harvard Business School student, and the question is for Tarun. Since that was the only question that came in, I'm just going to start with that. And she asks, what is the financial implications of this? I mean, does anyone make money, or how does that work?
It's a great question, and it has a complicated answer and a simple answer. The simple answer is that it's pulled off with incredibly minimal resources. I want to say in the few tens of millions of dollars for the entire exercise, which is really peanuts when you think about the number of people who come. As Rahul pointed out, he showed some images at the end, and maybe you can comment on this. A lot of the material that's used is being reused quite extensively, so some of it comes from other urban settings and other examples of temporary urbanism, and some of it gets dispatched back to it, which is why it's hard to get a complete cost-benefit analysis. But it's extremely efficient. The only other aspect I'd point to is that there is some center-state allocation of resource issues that has to be adjudicated in a federal system, just like in the United States. There's a lot of political jockeying for position and power. The state in which this happens, the Allahabad Kumbh happened, was Uttar Pradesh, which is politically extremely salient. It's in the so-called Hindi heartland of India. The guy who is in charge, has become a good friend of all of us, Akhilesh Yadav. He's the chief minister. He's running a state of 100 million people. He was a rookie chief minister, young kid, and I think was pretty nervous, which actually played to making sure that this very politically salient, from an electoral standpoint, so many people are coming out to vote, make sure that he puts his best people there and manages it tightly and efficiently and so on. So indirect answer, but maybe you want to comment on the readings?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll add a couple of things here. And to go back to, your question of the numbers, because a lot of the investment from the government, or their commitment of funds is based on projected numbers. But, we use 7 million because in the film you said 7 million. We believed you. Yeah. I mean, that's what we use.
That's Meera. Meera is in the audience. She's responsible for
anyway, but what's interesting, talking to vendors, they're small, little shops and things, they were actually very disappointed because the hype that had gone around was that there would be about 12 million people living there. This is because we'd been going there for a whole year in advance to prepare for this. And so the expectation was much higher, but there's a politic there because with a bigger number, the government can justify bigger allocation. So which means then there's corruption and there's leakage of money. So it is, the budget and the projected numbers is critical. And so clarifying the numbers for future planning and for much more precise delivery, whether it's materials from the region, things that are going to be recycled, will be much greater. So that's one aspect. The other thing that was interesting is it is becoming a terrain for speculation. One of the interesting moments for me was spending time with the Mela Adhikari, the man who runs the thing, and I said, look, there are a lot of guys waiting out there for you. You want to meet them? Go ahead, we can wait. And he said, no, I don't want to meet these guys. These are guys who are trying to, because we were there early, so these were guys who were trying to register trusts that they had formed so they would get allocated land, which they could then rent out to pilgrims to make money. So there's already real estate speculation, because you can only be allocated land in the grid if you're a registered religious trust or a form of an akhada, yeah. And so this kind of, the grid, while it clarifies, it also opens up this imagination, then because people see the territory more clearly, and then a kind of business speculative dimension enters. So that is occurring.
And to put it in perspective, only about 4% of the total budget is spent on healthcare. So the total budget of the Kumbh, about 4% goes to the healthcare piece.
And many of the beds were not even used, you said.
Yeah, so the pictures I showed you were for the beds in the peripheral hospitals, which were mostly serving the relatively well. If you had something serious, you got shipped off to the central hospital, and those beds were very extensively used. Whether there was trauma or major illness, etc., all of that went to the central referral hospital.
That one of the things in this research that I alluded to with the mathematician whose name I should use, JP Onella, Finnish guy, that actually speaks to the optimal allocation of healthcare facilities, was that you can use the cell phone data to infer patterns of movement of people, and use that in a very, very simple-minded way to, I calculated maybe triple or quadruple the efficiency with which you're using the existing healthcare resources. All you need is a willingness on the part of the Mela Adhikari, which I think in principle is there now, to say, yes, we have this data, even with the cell phones. And I'm not even talking about any sort of dynamic, fancy story where you watch people moving in real time. You can look at the past data and say, these are the sorts of situations which will lead you, which will predispose you to need a facility in this location at this time, and allocate it accordingly. But so far, we've not been doing that.
I'm going to share something, and I'm not even being funny because it's true. They have this huge lost and found tent set up, and I think Rahul showed pictures of it, and it's amazing that people get lost all the time, and they go to this lost and found place, and there's a big yellow balloon. And you can then go there and find your loved one. Now, in the past melas, some families that really couldn't take care of their elderly relatives used to go and drop them in the lost and found and say, the Lord will take care of them, and at least we're leaving them. But now with cell phones, they're like, where are you? I'm just kidding. But I think let's open it up to some questions.
Meera, I want to just to pick up on your lost and found,
yes,
but in a humorous tone.
Non-humorous.
It actually is called bhule bhatke, which means lost and abandoned. So there is no optimism. We use found, but that's why they are abandoned.
It is bhule bhatke.
That's just, so there is no optimism in the title anyway.
Yes, please.
First of all, thank you. I've been aware of the Mela for some time, but to have this perspective of actually analyzing what's going on is really fascinating. I have two questions. One is, Rahul showed pictures at the beginning of past Melas from even 100 or more years ago, and I'm wondering, in terms of the record keeping, how did that play into any of your analysis and research? And the other one was, we think about the way governments these days, including our esteemed government here in the United States, about keeping tabs on people and what they're doing and when and how. Is there any sort of record keeping in terms of, can anybody go to the Mela, and what sort of, do you have to apply? Can you just show up? What kind of record keeping is there, if any, and how would that factor into managing and then planning for future Melas, or addressing some of the issues that you've brought up in terms of planning for the healthcare, planning for the accommodations and all of that?
You want to take it? Well, great questions. Well, I think the record keeping started in about the 1890s with the British.
How long has it been going on, by the way?
Well, they say,
Centuries.
5,000 years, maybe. It's.
But there's been a real change in scale over time.
Yeah,
so the real scales of the Melas are in the past 100,
maybe 200 years long. So from the 1890s. Now, we didn't come across these archives in the prep work we were doing, but we were really lucky that the government, for some reason, it's all in the Allahabad University, they decided to do a little exhibition of the archives just before the Mela started. And so that's how those images that you saw, I got off the exhibition, and now they're in the archives for someone in the future. And that's why we registered them, and in the book also mentioned them, because it's a project in itself. The earliest records are really to do with public health. They are mapping diseases, outbreaks in time. They're also beginning to organize, for the same reasons of crowd management and things, which sects go to bathe at what time. They negotiate with them, because if you look at archival historic records, these are warring tribes. The Akhadas were originally warring tribes, and they were bloodbaths to get into the water at the right time, because that was the most sacred moment, and there are records of this. So the first thing the British did was crowd management and public health archiving. After that, they began to, I think 54, before that 42 or something, they began to actually rationalize these plans in terms of organization in space. So it was quite recent. I mean, those were among the earliest plans, at least we saw in the archives. Two things which are related to it is, one of the things about the records, because I loved his last question about what we can do for, in a speculative way in the future for cardiac care and things. Till the 50s, when I spoke to people who had been to the Mela in 1954, for example, one thing that most people who are much younger then, because you're talking to them now in their 80s, that they remember arriving at the railway stations, and there were large sort of infrastructure there for inoculations. You had to get inoculated before you went there. And they used to use the Kumbh, the government, because people came in from rural areas for smallpox, for typhoid, cholera, for inoculations. They're like inoculation camps. So it was a big site, and there are records of this in the Allahabad archives for inoculation. Today, I don't believe there is very good data keeping. I think what this team has done, and the allied universities, is the most. The maps I showed you showing broad sectors and the grid, that's the only document they operate off. They don't even have an organization chart. I say jokingly to my friends that this has been a really robust oral kind of tradition, because what happens is the Mela Adhikari gets appointed, then he begins to make calls within the bureaucracy to see who had been involved with it 12 years ago, and they assemble a team, and it's just this kind of oral institutional history. In fact, I'm scared the next one's going to get completely screwed up if they look at this as a handbook. They're going to blame us for a complete disaster.
Actually, so one of the questions you asked was who's allowed to come? Anybody's allowed to come.
Yeah, so anyone's allowed to come.
Anybody can come.
Yeah, it's
No.
So the only thing you have to register for is the allocation of a space, which organized religious groups do, and there are thousands of them. And then their devotees, people who are part of those sects, can come. But the big influxes that come in, where there are 10 million people who come in just for the bathing date, they sleep, they bathe at 4 in the morning and go back to their villages. They're there for a day or two at the most. Yeah.
Talking about can anyone come, I was just at Oprah's red carpet screening of her series, which is called Belief, which screened, I think, last Sunday. And Oprah was at the Kumbh. And she said it was just like such a profound experience. And more than that, it's like, she said no one noticed her there. She was just roaming around the Kumbh, and she said it was just amazing. Rachel says we have time for one more question. Yes, sir, up.
So the best do you know the written?
No, the date doesn't come to mind, but the Chinese traveler, the famous Chinese traveler,
Sound.
Yeah, oh, it's in sound, that's correct. The Chinese traveler, which I believe would go back to, I can't remember the date, but I think 1,000-something years. Yeah.
Again, the scale, though, is important to keep in mind. This is part of the tradition, but the scale at which this is operated is a more recent phenomenon and all the challenges that come with it. I wanted to actually quickly comment on that.
How big was the 1890 Kumbh for which there was some further direction?
From what I recall, I think for habitation, 2.5 million people. But from what I recall from the archives, I might be wrong.
Now, can I take a few more quick ones, Rachel? No? Yes?
You know, we're going to have a reception.
Okay.
People will have a chance, but unfortunately, it's so rich that we're all wishing there was more.
Okay. At this point, then I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'd like to thank Rachel from Asia Society. We have a reception outside to be continued. Please bring your questions with you. Thank you for being here.
Great.
I got you guys booked.